So hey everyone, welcome to this webinar, which today is going to be a case study from my own team about how we got down our hamstring injuries from 5 to 1, hence the title. The reason I wanted to do this presentation is because one of the things that really annoys me about social media and the current state of the industry and the information that coaches are willing to share, it's kind of like the phrase, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And I really believe that you can learn a lot from mistakes and failure. So I think it's important to share with you guys what went wrong for me in one area of my coaching, but more importantly, what we did about it. Because I've spoken to guys like Jada Mayo, Jeff Moyer, Graham Morris, and say, well, it's great that you got to a certain endpoint, but it's really important to see where you've come from. So obviously 5 to 1 is an 80% reduction in hamstring injuries year on year, which is really, really good, despite the bad beginning. So what I want to do today is talk about what we did and why and how we got those numbers to come down. So I'm going to begin by talking about what I did with a new team coming in, how I approached pre-season, how I approached all the training, and talk about how it went. And obviously you've probably already guessed it sucked because we had 5 hamstring injuries, but we're going to dig deeper and talk about why maybe it went wrong, and then what I decided to try and do about it and what the results were, and how I'm going to try and improve this moving into the future. So what I did coming into my current team was what I'd always done, and that was because I thought I had a good track record. And if you look at the injury stats that we had with Argentina from 2013 to the very beginning of 2016, there were significant year-on-year reductions. We still had hamstring injuries, but they were down on previous years. I'm not going to talk about weights, and that's because of the kind of Charlie Francis idea that weights are chicken soup. They're just detail. Nobody really tears a hamstring in the gym. If you do, you've probably really messed up. So I'm going to focus on speed. And that's because, as you'll see, that nearly all of the hamstring injuries we had occurred during speed training. So the typical speed progression that I used with my athletes from 2013 to 2016 was a 4, sometimes 5 phase progression, whereby we would begin with tempo because of its lower velocity, higher volume approach, build work capacity, prepare the body for the higher speeds and loads down the line. We would then build on that in phase 2 with sleds for accelerations and build-ups for maximal velocity. This is because it's obviously a progression in intensity and neural demand and load on the tissue from tempo work, but it's still not that you would expect in a 100% full sprint or flying sprint. That is obviously phase 3. Full accelerations up to around 30 to 40 meters. Flying sprints pretty much not beyond 15 meters, just because I think rugby players cannot maintain maximal velocity for that long. Then in phase 4 we move into what I call applied sprints, and that is basically combining the sprint action with different movements, trying to basically put all the pieces together. So maybe an acceleration begins by getting up off the floor or trying to beat a defender one-on-one and then accelerating. Or perhaps a flying sprint coincides with picking up a ball off the bootlaces and then building up to top speed, or running a curve through the posts and so on. You get the idea. So we're basically trying to take the sprint action and put it into a more game-specific context. And then obviously the physiological quality that we're most trying to develop with rugby players is repeat sprint ability in terms of the speed. So once we get into the phase 5, the very, very end of pre-season, we're going to start to reduce those rest periods, increase the density of work, and try and get that to reflect game demands. More specifically, a big emphasis on technique throughout. If you look at the Rugby Strength Coach blog, you'll know that I'm a massive advocate of technical mastery. The analogy I use is an F1 car. It's fantastic if you have an F1 car, but if you put Stevie Wonder behind the wheel, you're going to crash the car. So not only do we need to concentrate on the capacity to produce force, we have to teach our athletes how to apply that force in the most efficient and effective manner possible. So I put a massive emphasis on teaching guys how to accelerate and sprint at top speed throughout the year. Coming in, there was not a huge amount of management of the training load within GPS or within the training impulse. Very, very large spikes week to week from the historical data that I looked at. So I tried to limit myself in the number of things coming in that I really wanted to pay attention to. So because of the strong body of work that Tim Gabbett has produced, I paid close attention to managing the training impulse. That is minutes times RPE for all sessions. I also tried to manage total GPS volume within the same acute chronic ratios that Gabbett talks about, which is within 0.8 to 1.3 to 1, kind of like a buffer zone of 1.3 to 1.5 where you really have to be careful. We tried to concentrate on those two variables because they're simple and because it was just fewer numbers for the sport coaches to concentrate on. I didn't want to throw too many pieces of data at them at the same time. I didn't have a hugely strict approach to posterior chain training. We just did some every week and we tried to progress it logically. So generally from a base of volume to more intensity, building the speed, building the degree of stretch going through the hamstrings as we progressed through the preseason. I was not a fan of Nordics for a variety of different reasons. I think if you look at the mechanics of a hamstring tear during speed, they are biomechanically very, very different to sprinting. The speeds, the degree of muscular stretch are very, very different. And I think if you look at the studies with Nordics, you just see that Nordics work. They don't work necessarily better than anything else, and typically they're shown to work in populations that are allergic to iron and sweat, namely soccer and AFL. I just don't mind them. I'm not over the moon about them, but I'll talk a little bit more about why we do them. What we also did was very, very early in the morning speed sessions. That was because I wanted to squeeze that work in. My opinion is that speed is far more important than the gym work. It was not politically wise to try and convince guys to cut gym work and put speed in its place. So we had to squeeze it in, and early morning sessions was the time that we chose to do it. Wherever possible, measure the speed, get the gates out, track the stuff that matters, because what gets measured gets managed. So wherever possible, we were trying to time the guys on the various sprints that we did, paying close attention to the 10, the 40, and also flying 10 average velocity. So basically the final split of the 40, 30 to 40 meters, calculating the average velocity. Well, it actually went okay. There was a 30% reduction in lost availability due to injury on the previous year. However, from the perspective of hamstring injuries, this was without question the worst year of my career. We had 5 hamstring injuries. The first guy occurred during a foot plant in a match, trying to make a tackle, and it was a grade 2 tear. I believe it was 6 weeks out. Looking back, there were numerous issues, I think, that led to that. One was that he got married. He had to fly back from a different country. He basically got straight off the plane, went into the match, and this is an athlete who struggled with the lifestyle stuff, so nutrition, hydration, sleep, and so on. So looking back, a perfect storm. If I had my time again, maybe he wouldn't play, but ultimately that's not my decision, so it is what it is. Number 2 was a flying 10, grade 2. Number 3, exactly the same, actually occurred during the same session, probably the worst session of my life. Number 4 was a grade 1. I believe we lost a couple of weeks. It was kind of on the borderline between extreme tightness and a grade 1 tear, but I'm counting it as a grade 1. That was just during a very high speed effort during a team session. And the 5th athlete was a return to play athlete. We were conducting a speed session as part of his end stage rehab. He was running a 40 and it turned into a grade 2, which is obviously not good because you've extended that rehab period significantly longer than it needed to be there. So thinking about why it went wrong, there are many potential reasons. I'm not going to point to any one reason and say, this was the reason why it went wrong. But definitely looking back, there had never been that kind of emphasis on speed training and sprinting within the strength and conditioning program. It was a very gym dominant program. To that end, should we have been doing what I did with my previous squad, where there was a lot more of a history of sprint technique and sprint work, i.e. full speed accelerations, flying sprints, and so on? Perhaps the answer is no, because by definition, if you look at the stress that I exposed my athletes to and what happened, they were not prepared for that stress. Also, do Japanese athletes actually know what 80% of top speed is? So for example, if we're doing build-ups and I say, right, in week 1, we're going to build up to 70%, hold for a second and then ease off, and then we progress 75, 80, 85, 90, and so on as we build up to 100%, my guess is that either the players are not comfortable with or they do not understand what 80% really is like. So I'm quite confident that the 50, 60% truly was 50, 60%, and I'm very confident that 100% was truly 100%. But once we get into that 80, I think guys may have actually undercooked it and gone too easy. And the progression that I thought was going to be quite smooth was actually a significant jump up in intensity that perhaps guys weren't prepared for. The language barrier and communication, If communication is difficult, I think I've learned the hard way. You really need to simplify your approach and trying to get across certain concepts about management of intensity, technique, and so on, and being sensible in how we progress work. Perhaps didn't get across as clearly as I would have liked, or as clearly as I've experienced with other teams, even in Spanish. Japanese, it turns out, is really, really difficult. So I think perhaps I should have tried to circumvent that language and communication barrier a little bit more than I did. Also, should I be doing the riskiest, most technically demanding work when the guys are still half asleep? And perhaps some of them don't have the best sleep habits. Certainly one of the things that we did this year was to move speed to later in the day, and as you'll see, the hamstring injuries went down. So I think perhaps it's a factor. I'm not 100% sure, but that is potentially one of the reasons. Another one is time and gait anxiety. What I noticed was when we were doing races, the guys would actually look pretty good, but then the moment we got the gates out and they knew they were being timed, it went to shit. And I think 3 of the 5 injuries actually occurred when the guys were being timed, and you can visibly see the change. The warm up, the technique stuff, the build ups, maybe even a rep before the gates get turned on looked very, very crisp, very, very nice. But then the moment that the gates were turned on, all of the usual technical flaws would come out, kicking out the back, leaning forward too much, not enough knee drive, and so on. And I think anxiety is one reason to explain for that breakdown in technique. And obviously we know that breakdown in technique is going to heighten the risk of injury for a variety of different reasons. Maybe there was not enough focus on eccentrics or mimicking the mechanism of injury in the gym. Yes, it's chicken soup, according to Charlie Francis. No, your ability to perform Nordics or eccentric focused RDLs or any other exercise that you want to class as a hamstring injury prevention exercise is not going to have a direct influence on your ability to sprint fast in the field of play. I still believe that sprinting is the most important hamstring injury prevention exercise you can do, but perhaps there was not enough structure in the work that we were doing, and it's certainly a potential large upside for no apparent downside looking back, and that's one of the changes that I made, and that's what you're going to hear about later on. Was I focusing too much on the stuff that didn't matter? Speaking to other coaches who I really, really respect, Dan House, for example, he's spoken to me about high-level teams that don't even measure GPS volume below a certain velocity threshold, just because it's such low intensity. It doesn't actually represent a very large stressor to the body or injury risk. What he convinced me was that we actually need to be much more focused on the higher speed meters rather than the volume as a whole. Yes, it's important to manage volume just as an overall indicator of stress and the structural stress applied to the body, but specific to hamstring injury risk, we really need to be paying more attention to the fastest meters. Also, were the sprint drills that we were performing actually transferring to real running? And the question I asked myself, well, are my best drillers my best sprinters? And sometimes the answer was actually no. So you can do all the A's, B's, and C's, all the different drills, and it may look very nice and very masterful, but unless we're actually seeing that technique be robust to fatigue and all the other different distractions that we see on the rugby field, it could be argued that you're not actually going to see that transfer from drill to field, and that's obviously a problem. So to quote a friend and colleague of mine, Barry Solon, he said to me, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. Yes, it's really, really frustrating to have 5 hamstring injuries in one preseason. It's a real dent in my pride or anyone's pride when you want to believe that you're a good coach, that you're helping your athletes, and then reality slaps you in the face. So really important to me that we took lessons from this, learned lessons from this, and not make the same mistake again, because I think you only lose when you lose the lesson. So thinking back about what is the mechanism of an injury. An injury is, by definition, the athlete has been exposed to a level of stress which they're not prepared for, either in the short term through mismanagement or in the long term through a lack of preparation. Obviously, looking at the stats, what works great for one group of players is no guarantee of success with another group. So I had to think about, how do I make the training fit the group rather than try and change the group to fit the training. And this quote from a Japanese samurai, because obviously I'm in Japan, it really hit me hard, which is, truth is not what you want it to be. It is what it is, and you must bend to its power or live a lie. So I can say I believe the plan that we did in my first year was a great plan, and it may be for other teams, but reality disagrees. If you've got 5 hamstring injuries, you need to make some serious changes to what you're doing and try and bring those numbers down. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So firstly, I started by recognizing that there was an issue and realizing that I don't have all the answers myself. So I started by trying to speak to and learn from people smarter than me. I've listed a few of them here: Dan Howes, Lachlan Wilmot, Jada Mayo, Tony Holler, Henk Kruijnhof, James Smith, Graham Morris. There were many others that I learned from, but these were the most influential in the changes that we made between last year and this year to bring those numbers down. Looking back, as I mentioned, the decision making, the communication barrier, the inexperience, if that's an issue and I can't just snap my fingers and make it right, I decided to try and remove that decision making from speed training as much as possible. Obviously, it's important to give players ownership and input to the training process, but I'm going to try and match that to the experience and expertise that they have, which in Japanese rugby is strength work and pretty much nothing else. So we're still going to train speed, but I'm going to try and build things into the process to make it as not idiot proof, or yes, idiot proof, but obviously respectfully to the players, to just circumvent decision making as much as possible and try and automate the process. Another thing we did was to bring in a structured progression for posterior chain weight room work with an eccentric focus. Obviously, Lachlan Wilmot is probably one of the most known strength coaches in the industry right now for his work with Greater Western Sydney Giants in the AFL. I took a big lead from his work, but also from Henk Kruijnhof and Graham Morris in trying to structure our work. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but basically I didn't think it was going to be a cure-all, like a magic fix to all of my problems, but I thought it was at the very least going to cover my bases, potentially a large upside if you look at the research for potentially no downside or very, very low downside to our guys. So why wouldn't I do it? Looked at tighter management of the high-speed running in sprint meters via the GPS, expanded the Gabbett guidelines just beyond TRIMPS to applying this to HSR and sprint meters. This was obviously in relation to the conversation that I had with Dan Howes, where those are really going to be the risk factors or significant risk factors to hamstring injuries in rugby players, amongst others. Volume is probably not as important as the other stuff. So within the context of hamstring injuries, I need to pay closer attention to this stuff. If we are going to measure, we need to stress inoculate against timing gates. It's completely unreasonable looking back to expect athletes to be comfortable in a situation which is not every day for them. If the gates are new and they have testing anxiety, they're probably not going to thrive. So I need to do what I can to make that occasion more frequent, more comfortable, and get them used to being evaluated. I'm going to rely a little bit more on self-organization with a heavier focus on racing and allow the outcome, success and failure, to try and teach them for me and make learning implicit rather than explicit. Because, as I mentioned, when we do the races, rather than timing the guys or letting them run by themselves when they have to think about it, one way or another, they're going to find out a way to win. And if we can get more successful, efficient reps under our belt rather than bad ones, hopefully we're going to deepen those attractor whirls, quicken the motor learning, and make that technique more robust. In line with that, modify the drill progression in pursuit of enhanced transfer. So guys that were quite influential to me on that were Chris Corfist, John Pryor, Franz Bosch, even though I still think he's crazy. He certainly has a point about some stuff. And what I really liked about Chris and John's work is that they're able to validate that with numbers. That is one of the biggest criticisms that I have with regard to Franz Bosch's work. But seeing what John and Chris are doing, validating that stuff with numbers, I've become sufficiently convinced to try and implement more of those motor learning principles into the work that I'm doing. I should also give a shout out to Sean Mishka, even though he's probably better known for agility. His ideas were certainly helpful. I adapted the principles from Sean Mishka's presentation within the rugby strength coach community and tried to apply that to the speed work that we did this year. On the topic of Chris Corfist again, another thing that I did is dip to toe with RPR, Reflexive Performance Reset, and be activated from, which is basically Douglas Hill's work, which then Cal Dietz and Chris adapted into RPR. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, how we used it with the guys, and where I think that could be valuable to our program. So, removing player judgment. One of the big issues that we had was the tempo was okay, The sleds, that's okay because you just got 100%, but then the build-ups was a real problem because when you say, give me 70, 75, 80, 85, 90%, there was perhaps some misunderstanding or inability by the players to manage their velocity and progress that in a logical manner. They can go slow or they can go max, but then when you ask them to try and use their judgment to hit the velocities in between, perhaps there was a problem. So I decided, well, I'm going to sprint from the beginning because it's easy to get them to judge what 100% is. I just say, right, run as fast as you can. But what I'm going to do is try and manipulate the distance to understand what velocity they're going to be running each week. Because we know from research that by 10 meters, most athletes are going to be at around 75% of Vmax. By 20, it's going to be 85%. And by 30, it's going to be around 90%. Obviously, the faster guys, that may be a little bit later. For the fatter, slower guys, that's going to be a little bit sooner. But we know if we get them to go 100% and we just gradually progress the distance from week to week, we're going to be progressing the velocity from week to week. So we did a strict short to long progression from the start. The reason that we went short to long, this is one reason, but another reason that we went short to long is that by nailing the technique in the short distances, we're going to allow the technique to be more robust and efficient as we extend the distance. If you look at pretty much all of the decent sprint research, you'll see that errors in one stride are the cause of errors in the next. So we have to iron out those errors in the initial strides to make sure that technique is preserved in later strides and longer distances. So that is another reason why we did not do long to short. So here's what we did. In phase 1, we did short accelerations contrasted with heavy sleds. If you look at the research from JB Marin, Matt Cross, I believe Pierre San-Mazzino as well, you'll see that very, very heavy sleds are going to allow athletes to learn how better to apply the force that they have in a more horizontal manner, which is going to benefit acceleration. Also give a shout out to Cameron Joss about this, who has published a great article, I believe 2 great articles on Simply Faster about how he does this with his NFL guys. I believe it's about 50% of body weight or the load that's going to slow down your time by 50% for a given distance, which is going to be about optimal for generating power. Once we did that for a mesocycle, we dropped the sled and we just focused on long accelerations in a closed environment, building up to about 40 meters, because I know with my guys, the overwhelming majority of them are going to be at Vmax in the last 10 meters of that 40-meter sprint, which means that they're then ready to do flying sprints in phase 3, where we perform applied repetitions of both accelerations and flying sprints, which is adding in the movements and decision making that I talked about earlier. We're just trying to get sprinting to more closely reflect game demands. Then in the final phase 4, we dropped the rest period to increase the density of work, more closely reflect game demands, and performed repeat accelerations and flying sprints. The reason that I've kept that to the very, very end is that I do not buy into the idea that performing repeat sprints improves repeat sprint ability for a very long time. I think it's a very, very short window, and the best way to improve repeat sprint ability is to directly train sprinting ability and to directly train the aerobic system to enhance the resynthesis of ATP PC to preserve power output from sprint to sprint. So it really is the icing on the cake for me, and there are a lot of people out there that have a cake made entirely of icing. Getting into the flavor of the month topic that everyone seems to be really interested in, eccentric hamstring training. Yes, it's true. Nordic hamstring exercises do not reflect injury mechanics of a hamstring tear. They seem to actually focus more on semimembranosis and semitendinosis more than the long head of biceps femoris, which is the primary site of hamstring tears. There is a large degree of stretch in hamstring tears. There is no stretch in Nordic hamstring exercises. However, I've yet to see a study that say Nordic hamstring exercises make the situation worse. Admittedly in soccer, but a lot of them show massive improvements, massive drops in hamstring injuries. And, well, when you've got 5 hamstring injuries in one preseason, I'll pretty much try anything to try and bring those down. So there's no apparent downside. Maybe a little bit of soreness, maybe a little bit of people feeling uncomfortable, but there's a potentially massive upside in bringing those numbers down. So one of the arguments to counter the use of Nordics that people use is, well, Nordics don't even primarily stress the long head of the biceps femoris, which is true. They're going to activate the semimembranosis and the semitendinosis a lot more than the long head of the biceps femoris. But we need to try and understand hamstring injury biomechanics and physiology more deeply. I believe this research comes from David Opar and his hamstring group out of Queensland in Australia, which is if we have a hamstring tear, guys are going to show inhibition of the long head of the biceps femoris for up to a year post return to play. So even when they're back on the pitch, those hamstrings are not going to be activated and firing properly after a hamstring tear. So that means that something has to take up the slack of the work that's not being done by the long head of the biceps femoris. So perhaps we need to preempt that and utilize an exercise which the research shows is going to reduce hamstring injuries, but is also going to heavily tax the musculature that may allow the work of the hamstring to be spread more evenly across all three hamstrings and not expose the long head of the biceps femoris to so much stress. So taking what I learned from Lachlan, we went for proximal hamstring training once a week, distal hamstring training once a week. If you look at proximal hamstring training, that is pretty much going to transfer to the stance phase of sprinting. Distal hamstring injuries pretty much occur during the swing phase of sprinting. During the early stages of the training, we're looking at what Opar talks about as being long and strong. We're trying to develop eccentric strength in the extremes of range. The shorter the muscle fascicle, the weaker the eccentric strength, the higher the risk. So I believe they call it the quadrant of death. We're trying to avoid that quadrant by working in extremes of range and building athletes who are quite strong eccentrically. In the end stage, though, we're going to try and get away from that and try and mimic the conditions of the injury. One of the biggest criticisms that I have of Nordic hamstring exercises is they are so different to the mechanics of a hamstring injury, but perhaps we can take the foundation that we've built with NHEs and then build on that, transmute that into the conditions of a hamstring injury. Typically high force, high speed, a large degree of stress, and an oscillatory action like sprinting. So the progression through the 4 phases was we were trying to develop eccentric strength submaximally, then in the second phase using supramaximals. My instinct is not to jump straight to supramaximal eccentric training because it's dumb to do that with anything else. Nobody is going to get guys in the gym on day one and suddenly go to supramaximal squats where they can't even lift the weight by themselves. We know that we have to build a base of volume, increase the intensity in a logical fashion before we earn the right to perform supramaximal weight training. To me, the hamstrings are no different, so that's why we wait at least a month before we do that stuff. We start to build the bridge from the early stage to the end stage in phase 3 by bringing high-speed eccentrics, but admittedly still not the highest velocities that we're going to see on the field of play, also not the oscillatory action. That final phase 4, this is where I've borrowed most heavily from Henk Kruijnhof, also had some good conversations with William Wayland about this, and Cal Dietz has also been very helpful with his use of oscillatory movements in his triphasic programming. This is what we do in phase 4. So, in the submaximal phase, we give them what they need, not what they can handle. It's true, I probably could ask my guys to do supramaximals in day 1, but do I need to? Probably not. I think they're still going to get a lot of benefit from performing general exercises, not necessarily neglecting the eccentric action, but not just not focusing on it exclusively. So we're going to get strong, we're not going to neglect the eccentric, and we're going to try and pay attention to it in the training. So we'll perform Nordic hamstrings, but they're going to be band assisted, as you'll see. We'll do RDL variations, leg curl variations with a slow eccentric to try and put more eccentric stress through the muscle than normal. And we'll also utilize 2-1 variations, which is basically lowering on one limb to heighten the eccentric stress and then lifting on 2 limbs just to concentrate more stress on the eccentric rather than the concentric. We'll also do manual partner work, which you'll see, things like manual hip extension, manual leg curl. This is where you can just use a partner to provide consistent resistance throughout the range of movement, and also in later phases increase the velocity and increase the eccentric force if you have an intelligent partner who knows what they're doing. So let's take a look at some examples of the work that we did. First one up, this is a manual hip extension with a partner, and you can see that the partner, who I feature on my Instagram quite a lot, Sausage, is providing consistent resistance to Tani, working through a full range of movement. And he's obviously using his glutes and hamstrings to overcome the resistance. Basically, a reverse hyper for people that don't have money. Next one we're going to see an example of a band-assisted Nordic hamstring exercise. Personally, I like to get guys to sit on the heels and get the guy in the front to put the band on like a waistcoat and then hook the band around the other guy. Then the partner can provide more or less assistance or resistance by pulling on the band, but that's basically how it works. Trying to decelerate and control the velocity on the way down as much as possible Push up with the hands. This is one where we're not going to look to do the concentric just because it's a huge amount of stress, and with big heavy rugby guys, I've found that it's just not necessary, and also they can't do it. You can also progress this week to week by decreasing the band thickness or decreasing the band tension. So typically, if we have a 3-week block, we may go from green to blue to red, and then as you'll see in phase 2, we go into bodyweight style Nordic hamstring exercises. This is a TRX leg curl performed by one of our athletes here. Keep the hips extended throughout. Use the hamstrings in knee flexion to pull the body towards the box. This can be progressed by lowering the body relative to the feet or moving the box further away from the hands at the initiation of the exercise. Another way to progress this, or a useful way to progress this, is a trick that I stole from Mike Boyle, which is to put tape marks on the floor and just move progressively further along those tape marks, further from the hands to make the exercise harder and progress that in a logical manner from week to week. This is just a bog standard RDL, one of our rookies here, controlled eccentric, trying to get a big stretch in the hamstring so that we can build length at strength, strength at length, and then obviously power up nice and strong in a good hinge pattern there. So we're working both proximal and distal, flexion and both extension. When we get to phase 2, we're using supramaximal exercises. I mentioned that asking big heavy rugby guys to do the concentric is very, very difficult to do. So it's an almost exclusive eccentric or isometric focus on the exercises that we're using here. We're going to be using bodyweight Nordics and razor curls. We could use supramaximal eccentrics, so for example RDLs, trap bar deadlifts, stuff like that. Or we could be doing, for example, back extensions where the partner's providing a huge amount of resistance on the way down during the eccentric to overload. I would say that the trick here is the importance of partners and spotters that understand what they're doing. If you do not have 100% faith in your athletes to execute this, because obviously the risk is high, I would advise you to avoid them and go for exercises which there is no reliance on a partner. So bodyweight Nordics and razor curls. If you are going to do 2-1 work, this is where you actually want to use a super maximal load on the eccentric and then overcome that with 2 limbs on the way up. So here's what a Nordic looks like bodyweight only. I believe this is a female volleyball athlete. Not bad control. You'll see here in the middle, you do get like a lumbar hyperextension. This is one of the things that puts me off most about Nordics. So the way that I try to get around this is to cue, tense your abs like I'm about to punch you, squeeze your butt like it's your first day of prison, or any other more PC coaching cue that you like to use. But I think at some point you just have to take it on the chin that guys are going to get into this position. This is one reason that I'm not going to rely 100% on Nordics, and I'm going to try and coach guys out of it when they do it. This is the famous clip that made Lockie internet famous, the razor curl. Basically, hip flexion, nose to floor, extend the body out to load the hamstrings, and then come back up. Works both proximal and distal portion of the hamstring. Very, very advanced exercise. It is possible to progress towards this by using sliders on the hands to take a little bit of the body weight. I would use it sparingly from the floor. It's very, very hard. Probably easier to do on a glute ham bench or a glute ham developer. A little bit easier, but still a very, very useful exercise. A lot of bang for your buck if you're going to use that. Then we get into phase 3, high-speed eccentrics. Concentrating on a triphasic action, so we're doing all 3 contraction types, but we're doing an emphasis on rapid deceleration, eccentric contraction at length, because we know from length tension studies of muscle fibers, when they're at their highest length, they're going to be weakest. So to me, that means they're at the highest risk of a hamstring tear. So we need to concentrate on being strong at length. This is where we're going to use exercise like drop RDLs, banded kettlebell swings, drop back extensions, both unilateral and bilateral, and leg curl variations, manual and machine, where we're using high-speed eccentric. So here we're going to try and use tools that are going to artificially accelerate the eccentric portion and really force guys to drop quickly and get that stretch. So here's an example of a drop RDL. Where possible, I would like to see the feet almost drop off, the feet come off the floor a little bit, so we're getting a super fast eccentric, and then we're trying to reverse it as quick as possible, pushing the hips through and squeezing the butt. This is a banded kettlebell swing right here. So you can see coming down really, really quick. If you don't have bands, you can use a partner who at the top of the movement is going to push down on that kettlebell as fast as possible. You've already seen an example of a manual hip extension. You can do the same with a manual leg curl with a partner face down on a bench, and you just get a partner sat on their butt facing away to push the leg back. In this phase, you're going to encourage that partner to rapidly accelerate into the eccentric. So if we go back to this video of the manual hip extension, sausage and tanny, at the initiation of this, the partner is going to push down on those legs absolutely as fast as possible, and the guide in the exercise has to resist and produce as much force as possible during that eccentric to slow that movement down. Exactly the same principle in the manual leg curl. Possible to do in a machine leg curl as well. So for example, you may perform the concentric on 2 legs, take one leg away, and then drop very, very quickly on one leg, and then obviously reverse that with 2 legs. So you're just looking for ways that you can manufacture into the weight training program to perform very, very high speed eccentrics under high load. And then the last phase is, one more exercise. This is pretty much the same idea, reactive single leg split squat as stolen from Cal Dietz. You could say it's quad dominant, but I think if you've ever done these, you feel a huge amount of tension in your butt. I think the glutes are just as important as the hamstrings in preventing hamstring injury. This is because when the glute is unable to do its job, either through a lack of strength or a lack of patterning, you're going to get a hamstring strain. And through an interesting conversation I had with Chris Corfist, there's actually probably an evolutionary reason for this, which is when you tear a hamstring, you can still hobble away from the thing that is trying to eat you or kill you. But if you lose your glute, you'll lunge, in his words. So if we can increase the ability of the glute to do its job, perhaps we're going to take away a little bit of the work that's been put into the hamstring and reduce the risk of a hamstring injury. So phase 4 is the oscillatory movements. Again, triphasic, very high velocity, very rapid switching from eccentric or eccentric to concentric, obviously with that isometric phase in between, the amortization that we're trying to minimize. We do 3 or 4 main exercises, which you're going to see. We do a prone variation with a Swiss ball, a supine variation with a Swiss ball. We also do one standing, and we have another exercise which is, I don't have a video for, but it's basically a single leg back extension isometric, performing medicine ball slams to the floor, and it basically exhibits exactly the same mechanical characteristics that you're going to see in these exercises, which is the high speed, the oscillatory action, and the rapid stretching. So this is the supine version, bridging up through the hips, slamming the heels into the ball with a straight leg, hip extension. This is stolen from Henk Kruijnhof. Second variation is obviously going to be the more proximal portion of the hamstring, perhaps corresponding to swing phase, whereas this previous one is going to be stance phase, but exactly the same idea, kicking back, knee flexion, knee extension as fast as possible into the ball. And then we also perform a third variation here, which is straight leg, straight back into the ball, very high force, very high speed, as you'll be able to see from the video. I've had some discussions with other coaches about this. I think one of the criticisms about this is that we have to be careful about how we mess with the mechanics of sprinting, because what we see in this exercise is not representative of sprint mechanics. However, my retort to that is 2 or 3 sets of that a week when we're doing all of the other stuff that we are to try and improve sprinting speed, I don't think is going to water down sprinting to the degree that it's not beneficial. And I think it's basically an adapted version of the other 2 exercises that we've already seen. And the guys seem to like it and gravitate towards it. And I'm going to take that information on board and try and keep this in the program. So that's the eccentric training. Now let's talk about the management of high-speed meters, or high-speed running and sprint meters. High-speed running for most people is over 5 or over 6 meters a second. Sprinting, if you use out of the box, is over 8 meters a second. Some people use individualized zones of velocity. However, I'm not in a position where I can do that due to a lack of units relative to the number of players that we have, so we have to use out the box. But as I mentioned from the conversation that I had with Dan House, the faster the speed, the closer we need to manage it. So yes, I'm going to pay attention to total volume, but I'm actually going to pay most attention to the sprint meters in guys that I think are at risk or guys that are rehabbing a hamstring injury. Then I'm going to pay attention to the high-speed running, and then I'm going to pay attention to total volume. I'm using those modified acute chronic recommendations from Tim Gabbett, so I'm trying to get the biggest load that I can into my guys in sprint meters, in high-speed meters, but also I'm going to try and progress that in a logical fashion so that we never get above that 1.3 acute to chronic ratio week to week. So we're increasing it as fast as possible to get to the highest load possible that is not going to be counterproductive and increase the risk of injury unnecessarily. When the sprint meters are high, when the high speed running is too high, we're edging towards that 1.5, after which the injury risk really goes up. We're going to try and do certain things to modify that. Reduce the space that we provide players to do their drills in, increase player numbers because we're going to give them less space to operate in. People aren't going to do so much work. We may change the nature of the task. So, for example, when a player gets put through in space in team practice, they're not allowed to just gas the other player. We may blow the whistle after 5 minutes and say, break down or pass. You're going to change certain rules so that maybe you can only pass backwards if you're doing a small-sided game rather than pass forward, because then you're not going to get guys building up a ton of speed to get onto the end of balls. When those numbers are insufficient, however, we're pretty much going to do the reverse. We're also going to use tempo top-ups for multiple benefits, obviously aerobic functioning, but also because we're able to refine and reinforce sprint technique. But also, one of the big things that I've taken away from implementing tempo with our guys, as you'll see in webinar 17 on the Rugby Strength Coach, is that tempo is great for increasing high-speed running. If you're doing a high-volume tempo session, it can often double the volume performed above 6 meters a second on a week-to-week basis. So it's a powerful tool. You have to use it carefully, but it can have a significant impact on increasing high-speed running to get it where you need it to be. So this is just a snapshot of how we track it within our GPS system. On the right-hand side, this bottom red line represents the 0.8 of the 0.8 to 1.3 band that we're trying to shoot for. The top line represents 1.3. Obviously, we have a small buffer zone above that, but we're going to try and not use that. We just need that as a backup. The blue bars represent the weekly values in absolute terms week to week, and the yellow line obviously tracks acute chronic. So yes, we're going above that line a couple of times, but I think you have to bear in mind the impact of a week's holiday. Also, we've got that buffer zone. So yes, it's above 1.3. Is it above 1.5? No, it's probably not. And we're still controlling it fairly well from week to week. And, the proof is in the pudding. As you'll see, the injuries went down. So that is an example of weekly volume and weekly high-speed running on the right-hand side. On the left is actually what you see day to day. And the reason I have this graph is from a conversation I had with Patrick Ward, who is responsible for sports science at the Seattle Seahawks in the NFL. And one of the issues that we had with using Gabbett's guidelines is it takes a month to know that you messed up. So you're not going to get those chronic values until you've done a month of training, by which it's probably already too late, because we know that if you have huge spikes week to week, you're going to feel those effects and have increased risk of injury for the next 1 to maybe 3 or 4 weeks. So we need to concentrate on the day-to-day to manage the week-to-week, month-to-month. So what we have here on the left is distance and HSR again, but it's on a daily basis, and the undulating red lines represent a 7-day rolling average. And what Patrick kind of educated me on is, obviously, we want to keep the highs high and we want to keep the lows low. So on high days, we want to make sure that we're exposing our guys to more than normal, more than the rolling average, and get them above that red line. The further away from that red line are, the more significant that load is going to be, and obviously we're going to deliver, within reason, a stronger signal to adapt. On the low days, however, we need to make sure that we're below that line, and we're not interrupting recovery processes, so that we're giving our guys a chance to recover, and we're not going to increase our risk of injury long term. And what he convinced me was, if you have too many high days that aren't above that red line, you're not delivering a strong enough stimulus to get that load into them and make them robust to injury. But if you have too many days that don't fall below that red line on low days, you're not giving them sufficient time to recover. So what we want to see is hopefully what you can see in this graph here, which is alternating periods above and below that red line on our low days and our high days. We don't always hit it perfectly, but again, the proof is in the pudding, and it's been extremely useful to me. Lastly, we know from a recent study, which you can see here by Malone et al., that there is an inverted U, where if we're hitting above 90% of maximal velocity and we're exposing guys to high training loads week to week, we're going to see reduced risk of non-contact hamstring injuries. So we choose to do it through our speed, but we're going to perform some sprint reps at least a few times a week, no matter what the situation. We try and fit it in wherever we can to try and manage that load, in addition to all of the other changes that we're going to make to bring the hamstring injuries down and keep them down. So stress inoculation and a focus on racing. Like I said, they looked good in races, but it went to pieces in timing, and a large chunk of the injuries that we had occurred during timing just because I think they got anxious and technique went out the window. And I looked at the video and it's like night and day. You think these are rookie errors. They know not to do it and they still do it. And thinking back, well, is it reasonable to expect an athlete to flourish in a situation that they're not comfortable in? And obviously the answer is no, and perhaps I should be slapping myself, but either we need to remove that situation or we need to make it more comfortable for them. So one thing that we did is I listened to a former assistant of mine, Sam Portland, and concentrating on stress inoculation. So if that situation is stressful to them, I need to inoculate them to that stress. And Sam has been quite clever about this. Way before he tested, he just brings the gates out to the speed session. And then maybe the next week, he sets them up as if he's going to time them, and he doesn't time them. And maybe they just jog through the next week, and they get used to being timed. And then maybe they get to build up, and then he says, oh, listen, just give me 95%. And ironically, you actually find that most guys sprint faster when you ask for 95%. And then at the end of it, when they're used to that situation and comfortable, then you would ask for 100%. So that is one thing that we've tried to do, is just get them a little bit more used to the speed gates. Another thing is a conversation I had with Jake Schuster, which is guys want to win. When they compete, they will figure out a way to win. They will self-organize to sprint in a more efficient fashion. It's not a guarantee that when they win a race, they're going to sprint well, but typically more efficient mechanics do allow athletes to run faster more than not. So we're going to focus more on racing, and we're going to time occasionally, but I'm trying not to make a big deal out of it right now. I'm trying to take the numbers, the results in their context. Perhaps the numbers that we have from testing aren't the most accurate reflection of where guys are at because of the anxiety and the changes of technique that occur. So yes, I'm going to take those numbers, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. And where possible, I'm going to use those GPS values as a surrogate. So looking at things like peak acceleration and max velocity achieved in a game to try and get an idea of where my guys are at in terms of speed. And I'm pleased to say that we've had a couple of club records this year in the matches that we've already played within the game. So it does appear that speed is transferring to the field of play. Moving on to the modified drill progression now. Like I said, guys that I've really learnt a lot from in terms of motor learning: Chris Corfish, Sean Mishka, John Pryor, Franz Bosch as well. The idea, Jeff Moyer, I should also say. So it boils down to this: in any motor pattern, any skill, there are going to be bits that never change from repetition to repetition. So, for example, in sprinting, an upright posture, hip flexion in one leg, hip extension in the other leg, or triple flexion, triple extension in the other. There are also going to be parts which change from repetition to repetition. So, for example, perhaps the body angle, depending on whether a guy is trying to break through contact or run upright. The degree of torso rotation may change based on whether they have a ball or whether they don't. The degree of ankle stiffness may change based on the stiffness of the surface the athlete is running on. So the things that never change, the hard skill, is known as an attractor. The stuff which changes from repetition to repetition is known as a fluctuator. So in motor learning, what we're trying to facilitate as coaches is to allow athletes to find the attractors quickly whenever they perform a motor pattern. We need to deepen those attractor wells. That means allow athletes to find them more easily and more quickly. What we also need to do is provide athletes with a broad enough learning environment they are able to explore the fluctuators, learn how to adapt movement skills, motor patterns to changing conditions, because obviously the sprinting action within rugby is a highly variable environment, and we can use variability as our friend to try and allow athletes to do this more effectively. So if we use a small amount of instability or we modify the drill somewhat, they're going to learn with a small amount of noise amongst the signal to find the attractors more quickly. Also, using, for example, instability, modifying the task, they're going to be forced to explore the fluctuators and develop that learning that is going to allow them to adapt what they do in the field of play. Very, very important to progress drills to match athlete proficiency. So just because you've seen an athlete that worked with Franz Bosch doing all sorts of shit with a water bag overhead, it doesn't mean that your guys are ready to do that. I would argue that some of the guys you see in the videos are not ready to do that. For an example, a lot closer to home, speaking to John Pryor about his guys with Japan prior to the World Cup, it was obvious to me that they did a ton of work and that they earned the right to do this kind of stuff. So my advice is to start very, very simple and progress drills as your athletes master the drills. Do not just pick the fanciest thing that looks the most exciting off the internet. The way that you can vary the tasks is posture. So, for example, elevating a stick overhead is probably more going to allow athletes to find a stiff, neutral spine posture more efficiently than without. Things like instability. If you add maybe holding a med ball to an ankle jump, that is going to increase the force going through the ankle. It's going to teach athletes to be stiffer and pre-tension the shank when they contact the floor. You can also modify the task demands. You can shape the environment, which is obviously a massive principle of dynamical systems learning theory. You can shape the task of the environment to allow athletes to discover the correct solution for themselves and reinforce good technique, cement those attractors. One example of this is wickets. If you mess up a wicket and tread on the hurdle, it's because you overstrided out the front or you kicked out the back. So just by shaping that environment and say, don't tread on those hurdles, you're going to actually reinforce a good cyclical action of the leg during sprinting. The way that I've approached this is to break down the attractors of the sprinting action and select one drill for each one. So the ankle action, stiffness, and obviously extension through the floor. The residual phase, which is the first action of the heel off the floor, i.e. forward and up, not up and out the back. The recovery phase, so as the heel passes the knee and goes into the terminal swing phase, then into the transition, which is from the terminal swing back in the opposite direction, ground preparation just prior to the floor, the stance phase, the lateral hip stability, which has been a very important thing that I've learned about for me in the last year, particularly from Chris Corfist. What he calls running the tightrope is a massive drain on energy and efficiency in the sprinting action. So being able to keep a level, high hip, what Bosch calls a hip lock during sprinting, is going to be quite important, and also the posture. As with any motor learning, use your head and progress from a static to a dynamic pattern. Move from slow to fast, stable to unstable, and then closed loop to open loop. If you're going to add in decision making, it has to come at the end. You have to make it look good first without decision making, without response to a stimulus before you add in that kind of stuff. So here's an example of that recovery phase of punching that knee forward that Chris Corfus used. He calls them booms. We use these both band resisted on the spot, and we also use these in a dynamic fashion moving down the track. Looking for those legs switching in the air, and the cue that I use for my guys is punch the knee, punch the arms. Ankle jumps is another one. The example here is extensive, but basically for my guys, I'm looking for them to pre-tension the foot prior to contact with the floor, dorsiflex on the way up, and make sure that they're stiff and the contacts are snappy with the floor when they come down. James DeLacy here showing a good example of the hip lock. This is obviously exaggerated, but forcing guys to perform drills like this is going to teach them to use the quadratus lumborum, the glutes of the opposite side to the stance leg, and stop that hip dropping down, which is going to stop athletes running the tightrope. It's going to keep that stride width, which was recently demonstrated to be an important factor in sprint speed by a Japanese sprint group, the name of which evades me at the moment. Another good drill to use. Prime times is another one that I stole from Cal Dietz and Chris Corfist. Basically, a straight leg hip extension back through the floor. Very, very important to me in the rehab work that we do with our athletes after a hamstring injury, because as you can see, it is high force, high stretch, high speed going through those hamstrings at length, which is where it's going to be most at risk of a hamstring injury. But in terms of the sprint attractors, it's that pull back scissor action that we're looking for to minimize the braking forces during stance phase and also get into hip extension and propel the body forward down the track. Another example here is the wickets, which, as I mentioned, is a great way of shaping the environment to discourage overstriding or kicking out the back with your athletes. If you would like advice on how to set this drill up, I normally go for a 5 meter build-in so that they're already kind of upright as they come into the wicket, and I begin spacing the mini hurdles 4 pigeon feet, which is toe to heel, 4 feet initially, and then we'll progress to 4.5, 5, and then most rugby guys will top out, around 5. But obviously these track athletes at Altis, far better sprinters than any of my rugby guys. They will probably go to more than 5 paces. Really like this drill because it's implicit learning. You don't have to tell them anything. They'll instinctively sprint with good technique coming through the wicket, and then obviously the goal is that once you remove it, they're able to replicate that same technique. So now coming to the newest stuff that we've added in, perhaps the least provable in terms of the science, which is RPR, reflexive performance reset, be activated. A number of people have been extremely useful in exposing me to this, convincing me that it's worth a try. Chris Corfist, Cal Dietz, Douglas Hill, from the rugby strength coach community, DJ Williams, Graham Morris, Quinn Hennock kind of ties into this. I was initially skeptical that this stuff is snake oil, but I think if you look at the guys that I just mentioned, these are guys that make their living off of improving the numbers, and they're sufficiently convinced that the numbers are improving. So I'm going to look into it and give it a try, and as you'll see, it's quite promising. So the kind of rationale behind it is severalfold, but what you're not going to get disagreement from any strength coach or physical therapist is that the torso is the anchor for the legs. So better stiffness and positioning within the torso is going to provide a more stable foundation to flex and extend the hips and transfer force through the floor. And better positioning is going to allow for better transmission of force and more optimal force production of the legs. All muscles exist on a scale of length tension, and they want to be in the mid-range, not too stretched, not too contracted. And poor position within the torso is a great way to impair force production and incur a higher risk of hamstring injury. So if you just stand up now where you are and get into a hyper-lordotic position, you'll be able to see that you've lengthened your hamstrings. Now, if you think about pairing that with overstriding in a sprint action, it is easy to see how that puts the hamstrings under even more length and very, very high forces, and that is one reason, amongst many, why a hamstring injury may occur. What is the easiest way to lose position within the torso and get into that hyperlordotic position? Improper breathing mechanics and a stress response that puts you into extension rather than a neutral spine or more of a belly breathing, dominant breathing pattern. And that is the crux of what I learned from Quinn Hennock, and that is also the foundation of what RPR is. What RPR also is using pressure points and kind of self-massage techniques to manipulate the reflexes to activate muscles that we want to use and hopefully inhibit and decrease the tone of certain other muscles whilst concentrating on breathing mechanics and position, notably breathing from the diaphragm. There are acute effects which are very beneficial to sprinting and jumping that I can tell, but also Cal Dietz has done a great job of presenting information on his YouTube channel about other benefits to, for example, to sleep, to conditioning, to other health markers like HRV and blood pressure, I believe. So interesting food for thought, and I've piloted this with 2 athletes that we have in our squad. The way that it works in rugby strength and conditioning is when you're dealing with regular athletes in the team, the numbers, the time available, and the resources available often prohibit you from trying to implement new techniques. Typically, when you are dealing with rehab athletes, though, you get a lot more contact time. There is no deadline. The schedule is more flexible. That allows you to implement new ideas, test them out on those guys, see how it goes, because typically they're more receptive. They want to be back in the field. And then if it does go well, then you can roll it out to the entire squad. So there are 2 athletes in our squad that I've done this with this year. They've been doing RPR before their sessions. I taught them once, and now they do it themselves. And interestingly, I can see them doing it themselves without being asked. So they seem to gravitate to it. They seem to like it. And when we were testing our guys recently in sprinting, they were not part of the main squad. One had a dead leg, and he kept trying out. He said, can I do a 10? Can I do a 10? I said, well, listen, you can do a 10, but don't let anyone see you. He did it, and he actually ran 1/10 of his best ever with a dead leg. And that's extremely promising to me. The second athlete had a back spasm following a heavy squat. For several weeks had done no heavy weight training or sprint training at all. It was pretty much just getting him mobile again, getting him on the bike, getting moving. And he actually ran his best ever 10-meter time at the club. He's been a professional for nearly 10 years. He's a very strong athlete. He's sprinted before, but he actually seems to have bought into this more than the other guy, even though the first guy had bought into it. And he's run his best ever 10. And to me, these are athletes that had no business producing those numbers, Perhaps there are other variables involved. Maybe it was rebound from too much training. I don't know, but certainly I thought the load was well managed for both of them prior to them being unavailable for the team. I think certainly RPR may be one of the reasons why they were able to produce those times, and the fact that they've naturally gravitated towards it. I think athletes are not dumb. They figure out what works for them and what is going to help them perform better. So I think certainly food for thought. So this is just an example of some of the stuff that we do with our guys. I put this up on Instagram last year. We do bring in belly breathing for our guys on match day. Where possible, we will encourage guys to do belly breathing as often as possible with eyes closed. Eyes closed belly breathing, aka meditation. Just don't tell rugby players. The benefits of that are obvious. I've written a massive piece on the blog about this meditation for athletes. And on the right hand side is an example of the diagram that we use to highlight the various points where we're going to apply pressure with the self-massage techniques. There are also points on the front of the body which you're going to see in the subsequent video. Again, it's one of these things where I think there's a massive potential upside for a very low potential downside. I don't see anything wrong with taking an extra 5 minutes out of your day to concentrate on your breathing, close your eyes. Even if we just do that, they're going to get benefit from that physically and psychologically, but then also potentially we're going to get a significant improvement in the reduction of hamstring injury risk from speaking to other coaches that have put me onto this stuff. So here's an example of this being used at Merrimack Track and Field, a university squad that RPR have worked with. And you can see the whole time they're doing this, they're concentrating on belly breathing, good breathing mechanics, and it really doesn't take that long. It's about 5 minutes working through the different zones of activation. And this is just prior to the main warm-up, I believe. So if you're interested in this, you would like to learn more about this, I'd refer you to the RPR website to speak to the guys and see if you can get yourself onto a course. That's definitely something that I would like to do in the next year. And as you'll see in later slides, I do want to roll this out for the whole team. So the results were 5 in the previous year. This year, in 2017, we had just 1 hamstring injury. The mechanism was it was a rapid change of direction in an athlete that we were rehabbing for an ACL. I don't believe it was overload. The training load was well managed. However, he had done tempo work prior in the day, which is obviously, as we said, a large number of high-speed meters. So perhaps the order was incorrect. Again, that was a constraint that I was working under. The work had to be done then, but looking back, that's maybe a reason. Another reason is potentially compensation, just due to a little bit of tenderness at the grass site. So, I'm annoyed that it wasn't 0, but an 80% reduction year to year is a significant reduction, and I'm sure amongst all of the changes that we made, some of them have definitely had a really beneficial effect. Some probably did nothing, but unfortunately, I don't live in a perfect scientific world where I only change one thing and then I test for a year and see what happens, because I'm going to try and get the biggest reduction in injuries that I can. Did we have a couple of near misses? Yes, absolutely we did. We had some guys that said, listen, I feel tight. I feel like I'm at risk of a hamstring injury, but we headed this off. We modified their load, or we pulled them, and we only lost them for the rest of the day. So is that annoying? Yes, it is, but it's far less distasteful than losing them for 2, 4, 6 weeks because of an injury to the hamstrings. Ongoing improvements in top speeds attained in a match. As I mentioned, we had a guy hit 9.6 in a game the other day. That is probably not a true max, as you know, because of the nature of play and the different demands or the different characteristics of sprinting in a rugby game. Guys are probably going to be able to hit higher in a track situation. That's extremely encouraging to me. It's a club record. It wasn't a freak occurrence. He hit 9.5 in the rain the next week. We had another guy this week hit 9.5. So I'm encouraged by not only the reduction in hamstring injuries, but also the continued improvement in performance, because in an ideal world, we want both. We don't just want one and ignore the other. So for the future, I would like to get some eccentric values to function as a basic red flag. Technique is obviously one side of the coin, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to produce force. And if we have significant decrements in eccentric force, both absolute values, relative values, and also left or right, these are red flags for hamstring injury risk, which we know that from David Opar's work and from the technology being used in the NordBoard. Do I have that right now? No, I don't. I would like to try and get the budget to do that, but there is also some promising work from JB Marin, which looked at force at velocity 0, horizontal force, in force velocity profiling of sprint performance. We're currently doing it for jumping for limited players, but I would like to extend this out to sprint performance. One, so that I can individualize the sprint work to give them more of what they need, not just a general template, but also to try and use F0 as a surrogate for hamstring injury risk. I would like to bring the gates in more, get them comfortable with that so that I can use those gates to set the volume of sprint work being performed, to make sure that the quality is there from rep to rep, and also to collect even more data, because if you use it in an intelligent manner, more data is going to allow you to make better informed decisions and hopefully make more improvements to performance with the athletes that you work with. Next, I would like to bring in squad-wide RPR. I'm intrigued enough. I think there's enough promise there that it merits bringing in the technique for the whole squad. And like I said, at the very least, it just means that we're going to get 5 minutes of meditation or belly breathing a day out of guys. And I don't think that's controversial at all. I think the benefits of this are well known, and I would like to roll that out across the squad. But with herding cats as it is, this may be difficult, but that's going to be my goal. And obviously the last goal is that I want to make these injuries 0. So that's the end of this presentation. If you've enjoyed it, please share it. And if you have any questions, please contact me at any of the social media platforms under Rugby Strength Coach, or you can reach me at keir@rugbystrengthcoach.com. And I look forward to your questions and interacting with you.